AJ Williams. I am an admission counselor for Santa Clara University. I've been in the field for a long time, about 15, 16 plus years. And I enjoy it, and I like it a lot. And the part that I really like is the opportunity to meet with students, families, counselors, and really kind of break things down and explain sort of the bigger picture, not just in terms of my school, but just, again, higher education in general. I was a first generation college student, and all that good stuff. So I kind of, found my way through things. And now that I'm in this position, I like to help folks do that. And so with that, last year, wrote a book that's, it ain't rocket science, college counseling for everyone. I think it was kind of perfect timing given the varsity blues scandal and all that kind of stuff. This is a subject that I know we talk about like it is rocket science. Everybody kind of gets, freaked out about it. And so I said, let me kind of break it down for everybody and everybody, whether you're coming from an area with a lot of resources or none, and so that's what this presentation is. I apologize now. I'm going to be talking quite a bit, but hopefully this is something that's going to be useful for you. And the presentation is broken up into 3 sections. And so we'll kind of get going, all right? But I think the best place to start, when you're having this conversation is about demographics and socioeconomics, right? Having these kind of conversations, these real conversations, it's best to put everybody on a level playing field. And I think the best place to start with one of these conversations, again, is just understanding how many people are there in the US, how many people are there of a particular race or ethnicity, where are groups concentrated, right? Because that's why your neighborhoods look the way they do, your schools look the way they do in the K through 12 level, your colleges and universities, that kind of thing. And so a lot of times we get questions of, how diverse is your school? How diverse is X, Y, or Z? And again, I like to take a step back and just sort of break it down for everybody. Socioeconomics, right? It's important to tie together the impact of education, educational attainment, and life outcomes, right? And again, this is really meant to be empowering. It's meant to just sort of give you the lay of the land and really kind of empower you as the student, the parent, the counselor to inform yourself and plan a path ahead, all right? And I want to make note too that all this information comes directly from sources that are listed here, right? So if you ever have questions or you want to say, okay, well, where did that come from? It's listed right here in the survey, and so, or in the presentation. And so, to begin with, all right. And so, for the 2013 through 17 American Community Survey, which comes from the U.S. Census Bureau, and they do an estimate of about a 5-year span. For the most recent data that I found, we're utilizing a number of 321 million Americans, okay? 321 million Americans, as of right now, probably closer to around 330. But again, when I was writing the book and doing this research, we're dealing with a sample size of about 320 million. And so that said, the non-Hispanic white or Caucasian or the white population is about 64% of that 321 million number, right? And so if you are from California, if you're not from California, if you lived anywhere outside of California or in the continental United States, and you are a minority, you probably have realized this is a very white country, right? It's just, when they say that term minority, meaning African-American or Hispanic, Latino, or Asian, that's a mathematical reality. That's not a derogatory term, right? And so about 64% Caucasian. As you can see here from this graph, this really, it's red or blue based on the counties that are above or below the national average for white representation in a county, which is about 80%, meaning the average American county is about 8 out of 10 folks white, right? And so again, the country is very white and they're spread out, basically literally everywhere. For the Hispanic Latino population, there's about 50 million plus Hispanic Latino folks in the country. And as you can see, primarily located on the western and southwestern edges of the country, with some representation down in Florida and along the East Coast, just like the African American contingent. The Hispanic Latino population tends to be centered around in or around major cities, or unlike the African American population, in some rural kind of agricultural areas. All right. For the African American population, there's about 38 million African American or Black folks in the country, and only about 8% of the African American contingent is out on the West Coast. So if you are in California, there's fewer of us out here along the West Coast. The majority of the African American population is concentrated in the South, in the Midwest, or in the Northeast. And again, primarily concentrated in and around major urban areas, right, urban cities. The Asian population is about 15 million Americans, and that equates to about 6%. And I'll back up a little bit. The African American population is about 13%. The Hispanic Latino population is about 16%, right? So the Asian population, about 15 million individuals, that's about 6% of the US population, and they're primarily concentrated on the coasts, right? And so again, it's important to realize that, because again, when you're talking about why your neighborhood looks the way it does, why your schools look the way it does, why colleges and universities look the way they do, those are realities that play into that. And so yeah, just good to know. Now, California is a little bit skewed. I'll go back a little bit. California is a little bit skewed in that California is the most populous state in the nation. It's about 40 million Californians. We're about 35% Hispanic Latino, 33% Caucasian, 15% Asian, and only about 5% African American, right? So California's a little bit different. Educational attainment by demographic. And so again, the green bar represents high school graduation, or the high school 100% of whatever demographic, white, Asian, African American, Hispanic, Latino. The orange bar represents high school completion, right? And so the good news is that, as of now, high school completion is the highest it's ever been in the country for all demographic groups. But you'll see, 92% of white folks are graduating from high school, about 87% of Asian folks, 85% of African American folks, and about 67% of Hispanic Latino groups or students. But I think that number really is more so influenced by the more recent, folks to the country. That red bar represents the folks who have attained at least a bachelor's or higher for that demographic, right? And so 35% for the white population. Now that said, while that's only 35% of 65% or 64% of the country, that's a whole lot of people. There are almost as many white college graduates as there are African Americans in that college age range, right? And so again, just sort of perspective there, the things to keep in mind. The Asian demographic, culturally, probably hands down the most strong commitment to educational attainment of any group. You'll see, 53% of those folks have at least a bachelor's degree or higher. About 20% for the African American group. Hispanic Latinos about 15%. Why is that important? Because, I apologize for the dog if you hear that. That's not my dog. This is an equation I came up with a long time ago, and I like to use it because I think it's simple. It's something that's, you can remember. Education plus time equals $. And if you're at home, if you're with your mom or dad, with your grandparents, whomever, I want you to say this again. Education plus time equals $. And what I mean by that, it's a simple formula, but what it equates to is that the more educated you are, the more likely you are to be compensated as such, right? Meaning, an anesthesiologist. An anesthesiologist is the person who puts you to sleep before you go into surgery. And if they do a bad job, you might not wake up, right? So there's a lot of responsibility there. A lot of education has to go into that. Anesthesiologists make anywhere from $300,000 to $400,000 a year, right? So outside of athletes and entertainers and CEOs and all that, anesthesiologists the highest paying job in the country, right? So education plus time equals $. That said, the flip side of that is that, grad school and all that can be pretty costly as well. So you got to think that out. It's mind-blowing stuff, isn't it? If I was in person, I'd be making y'all laugh, I promise. It's a little tougher over Zoom. But again, to sort of drill home, that equation, education plus time equals $, here's something to look at, right? And so this, again, is from the community survey from the U.S. Census Bureau. And this is the government telling you that for folks who are 25 years of age or older working full-time, this is the average salaries they're looking at, right? For everybody, you're at about $38,000 a year. Again, if you're outside of California, that might be okay. In California, that's almost poverty level, right? That's not a whole lot of money. Less than a high school graduate, about $22,000 a year. High school graduate, $29,000. You see it start to go up a little bit. A bachelor's degree, $52,000. A graduate, a professional degree, almost $70,000, right? You see where that trend is going. Again, unemployment rates and earnings by educational attainment, less than a high school diploma, about 5.6% unemployment rate. Doctoral degree, 1.6% unemployment rate. Median usual weekly earnings, right, for all workers, on average about $932 Less than a high school diploma, $553, right? About almost half of that. A doctoral degree, $1,800. A professional degree like a JD, almost $1,900, right? Almost double that average, right? And so again, I'm not a mathematician, but these trends make sense to me. Poverty rates correlated to educational attainment. Less than a high school degree, a little over a quarter of folks are in those poverty rates are lower. High school graduates, 14%, some college or an associate's 10%, a bachelor's degree or higher, the least likely to be in poverty, right? 4.5%. So some things I want you to take away and think about. Why is it important to know the numbers, right? As I kind of stressed before, when you folks have questions for us in terms of, how diverse is your school, or, whatever kind of questions you have, it's important to know the bigger picture, right? And then you can kind of divide things up from there. What are the demographics of your county? Okay, again, you don't have to have answers to this right now. These are things I want you to think about. What are the demographics of your county? Did or does your high school reflect that? If in college, does your university reflect that? Why or why not, right? What is your academic goal? How long will it take you to get there? Okay, high school, 4 years. To get a bachelor's, an additional 4 years. To get a master's, 2 years on top of that. You get a JD or your law degree, 3 years. Medical degree, even longer, right? You got to think about these things. How do your career goals align with societal needs, and why does that matter? Okay, and so that's the end of the first section. If you want, grab some water or something like that, think about some sections. I'm going to dive right into the second section, which deals with the achievement gap, residential restrictions and school funding. And so here's the point where we take a step back and really, when you hear that term systemic oppression, systemic racism, systemic whatever have you, this is going to get to the root of that, right? And so again, I wrote the book to be as apolitical and non-political as possible. But the reality is, when you're dealing with education, when you're dealing with societal realities and things like that, you got to get into this stuff, because to ignore it is to not have a true conversation, right? And so we're going to jump into that. The achievement gap, what that refers to is any significant and persistent disparity in academic performance or educational attainment between different groups of students, such as whites and minorities, for example, or students from higher income and lower income households. What I want everybody to realize, and the book does a really good job of hitting this home, is that it's really a conversation of resources, and how society was kind of shaped to present. The system ain't broken. It's producing the results it was intended to. And so that's the achievement gap. Persistence is the key. This isn't a one-off, right? The achievement gap is sustained over time. It's applicable to standardized test scores, math and reading levels, graduation and dropout rates, disciplinary infractions, absenteeism, socioeconomic outcomes, etc. Because an academic achievement gap leads to a socioeconomic achievement gap, okay? Just for some examples, the achievement gap in terms of test scores, and this is again coming from the Digest of Education Statistics and the College Board, the folks who produced the SAT. And so from 1997 to 2017, you'll see that for everybody, on average, you're talking about in the, breaking 1,000, then different then the breakouts by different demographics. Historically, currently, to this day, the Hispanic Latino population and the African American population, down towards the bottom end of things, right? I think it's good. It's been a great development to see that many schools are going test optional, right? In this new COVID era, they've been forced to. A lot of schools have wanted to and talked about it, but COVID has kind of forced that hand. This is a perfect opportunity for these folks down here to really kind of step up in other areas and say, okay, look, that aside, I know I'm strong enough to get into your school, that kind of thing. I want to talk about the state of high schools, right? Because again, from what I see as somebody who's been in this field for a long time, I've visited schools in cities, out in rural areas, on the East Coast, the West Coast, and internationally, right? Really, there's generally three types of high schools. You got your publics, your public privates, and your privates, right? A public is that school in your neighborhood, right? The school that just based on where you live, that's where you should go. A public private is that kind of school that is in one of those nice areas, nice zip codes, and just by virtue of where it's located, because of the resources that they have available, they have as many resources and access to resources as a private school. We can all think of those, right? Think about where you grew up, what was a nice school, where was a tough school. We can all think about those public privates. And then private's pretty straightforward, right? The key difference being funding. And so the big pie graph here represents on average nationally how high schools are funded, right? So about 8% of funding for public high schools comes from the federal government. About, 47% comes from the state, and then 45% comes from local revenues, right? Which is usually tied to property taxes and things like that. And that's the part where it gets interesting, okay? Down here, you know, increasing instead of decreasing segregation, right? Brown versus Board of Education was what? That was, you know, in the 50s and the 60s, maybe around 64, something like that. You know, high schools now, it's 2020. High schools now are as segregated as they were back then or more in some places. High schools are increasingly either primarily Caucasian or predominantly Hispanic Latino or African American, or in some pockets on the West and East Coast, predominantly Asian, right? And that's a trend that we don't want to be seeing, okay? But that's the reality. In my opinion, you know, the formula for success in high school is pretty straightforward. As my dad used to say, go to school. Your teachers don't want to flunk you. Go to school. You go to school, you pay attention, you do the work, you're gonna get through high school, right? It's a pretty straightforward formula, but that can get complicated by quite a few things, right? Depending on where you're coming up from, gang pressures, you know, divorce, homelessness, peer pressure, drug abuse, anything you can think of, bullying, whatever have you. Maybe you have to work a job, you know, that kind of thing. No one is immune. I don't care what your socioeconomics are. No one is immune to any one of these sort of obstacles that can complicate that simple high school formula. But depending on where you're from, depending on what you look like, depending on a lot of different things, some of these can be daily obstacles for you, or they can be abstract concepts that only other people deal with, right? And so again, just something to keep in mind. And the reason that's something to keep in mind is that there's no accident that our neighborhoods look the way they do, okay? Now, and again, you know, I know this is a national presentation, right? But I know the Fulfillment Fund is you know, located, is centralized in Los Angeles, right? And I've had Los Angeles as my territory for years, for as long as I've been in the field. So, you know, this part right here speaks to the fact that there's a reason South Central looks like South Central, and Watts looks like Watts, and Inglewood looks like Inglewood, and Palos Verdes looks like Palos Verdes, right? There's a reason that Eastside San Jose, where I live, looks like it does, and Los Gatos looks like it does, right? And it's, again, for a lot of different reasons, but the most telling one I can point to, and that many folks point to, is racial redlining. Discriminatory federal, state, and local housing policies and practices nationwide from the turn of the century. And the issue is, and the reason why this is systemic and still an issue, is that these issues have never truly been addressed or remedied. Never, right? And so what I'm about to show you now in terms of the examples of how our neighborhoods were created and designed and all of that, these guidelines were never really addressed. And so our neighborhoods have just perpetuated these realities over time, okay? And again, this is an example of that. This is coming from the 1936 Federal Housing Authority Underwriting Manual, meaning this was the guideline that the government put out to say that if you are in real estate, if you are developing a community and things like that, these are things you need to keep in mind. And so I'll read through this quickly. The evaluator should investigate areas surrounding the location to determine whether or not incompatible racial and social groups are present. To that end, an intelligent prediction may be made regarding the possibility or probability of the location being invaded by such groups. We've heard some of that rhetoric, right, from the current administration. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and a reduction in values. Last one. The social class of the parents of children at the school will in many instances have a vital bearing. Thus, although physical surrounds of a neighborhood area may be favorable or conducive to enjoyable, pleasant living in its locations, If the children of people living in such an area are compelled to attend school where the majority or a goodly number of pupils represent a far lower level of society or an incompatible racial element, the neighborhood under consideration will prove far less stable and desirable than if this condition did not exist. In such an instance, it might well be that for the payment of a fee, children of this area could attend another school with pupils of their same social class. Okay? And so, again, just things to think about, nothing to dwell on, because again, if you're in those situations, that's out of your control. But again, if you don't know this, then you're powerless to do anything about it, right? You're powerless to empower yourself with the knowledge that it will take to overcome these obstacles, all right? And so this information right here, 2018 home ownership by demographic, and again, this comes from the US Department of Commerce. What we saw then was that about 74% of white folks own their homes. Hispanic Latino folks, that's about 47%. The African American community is about 42%. Those are the exact same ratios that they were, percentages, that they were in 1968, okay? And so again, so some stagnancy there, right? Things to think about. What is the public school funding model for your state? Can you think of other societal factors that influence the achievement gap? How would you suggest that we address the achievement gap as a society? And how would you address the inequities of our neighborhoods? Okay, all right. So I promise that's the heavy lifting. Now we get back to the fun stuff, all right? Creating your plan of action, okay? And again, if knowledge is power, then I want to drill home the point that education is elevation. It's out of elevation, out of ignorance, out of poverty, out of oppression, out of that systemic oppression that we just kind of bear witness to. The state of higher ed, it's expensive, as you all know, I'm sure. The average for public four-year schools is about 29, almost $30,000, and that's again for in and out-of-state students. For private not-for-profits, that's about $49,000. These are the averages for the 2018-19 school year. Some privates are nearing around $80,000 a year. And I want you to just consider that number right now, right? That's insane. If you're paying full freight, that's like $320,000 a year for a four-year degree, for a bachelor's degree. That's insane. Uncertain. A lot of schools, and this is something that the high school folks, the K through 12 folks might not be aware of, but closures among four-year public and private not-for-profit colleges average about 5 per year from 04 to 14, and mergers, right, where four-year state systems and community college systems would come together, that kind of thing, averaged about 2 to 3. Under fire, education is increasingly becoming politicized, right? There's an increasingly adversarial view of the academy. There's increasing time to degree completion and all of that. Costs are rising, all of that. But again, as we saw in the first section, it's still necessary at the individual level, at the group level. Education plus time equals dollar signs. Education leads to advancement, and it allows one to sort of rise above their station, if you will. The state of higher ed, most students attend public schools. So again, if you're a California student, this is the UCs, the CSUs. If you're coming from outside of the state, any of your, the public school systems, most students in the country, about 45% of all students, college students, attend public four-year schools. 33% attend public 2 years, community colleges, all right? And the point I want to make here is that transferring is much more common and much more utilized than folks realize. For all college students, about a third of them will transfer at some point, whether that's from a 2-year school to a 4-year school, or a 2-year school, to another 2-year school, or a 4-year to a 4-year. About a third of all college students transfer at some point. Only 20% attend private schools, right? I work at Santa Clara University. That's a private school. Down in Los Angeles, you have USC, LMU, the Claremont colleges. Only about 20% of college students attend public schools, and that's a big reason why, right? They're more expensive. The fall 2012 cohort. So what's important to realize here is that college has increasingly become a 6-year venture, right? Where it used to be seen as a 4-year school was a 4-year venture, and a 2-year school was a 2-year venture. What we're typically seeing now is that Community colleges, it's taken about 3 years to get out of that. 4-year schools, your state schools and things like that, it's taken about 6 years. So the national way that graduation rates are reported, whether you're hearing that from an admission counselor or you're seeing that online or in publications, the standard way of reporting that is a 6-year rate. So just be careful and make sure that you ask the right questions when you're looking at graduation rates and things like that. And so again, the fall 2012 cohort really equals the class of 2018. This is the part where, again, when I'm in person, I really like to kind of break it down. There's really, I don't care how many or what publication you're looking at, US News and World Report, the Princeton Review, whatever have you, they're going to try and, put all these schools into different categories and things like that. Really, when you're saying 4-year institutions in this country, you have a lot of options. There's upwards of 2,000 plus options, and they really fall into one of 3 categories. On one end of the spectrum, you have traditional liberal arts colleges, which size-wise are some of the smaller schools you're going to run into. Your high schools, if you go to public high school, might be as large or larger than some of these liberal arts colleges. Occidental College out in Pasadena is about 2,000 students. My alma mater, the University of Puget Sound up in Washington, about 2,600 students. Emerson out in Boston, 2,000 students, right? You get the picture. They're smaller environments and have the benefits and the drawbacks of everything that comes with a smaller environment. That's one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, you have much larger, public flagship research institutions, R1 institutions. Again, we have the CSUs and the UCs in California. UCLA, I think, might be our largest at about 45,000 students, right? University of Arizona State University, I believe, is the largest university officially in the country at close to around 80,000 students, right? Different reality academically there, especially the first year, second year. You're talking about being in, large lecture hall classrooms of 300, 400, 500. I've heard of 1,000, 1,500. They get pretty big. I'm in charge of the transfer process at Santa Clara, and so I read all the applications of folks coming from all the different types of schools. I get a pretty good sense of the realities academically and socially at these different types of institutions. A medium-sized school to me is anywhere from, that 5,000 to about 20,000 range. And so what I like about schools that size, they're not too small where you feel like you know everybody, or at least everybody you want to know, but they're also not too huge, too large where you don't get to know anybody really on a personal level. And there's some more sort of flexibility, again, with smaller or medium-sized schools. And so just things to think about, right? So College Counseling 101, your first year, and hopefully we have folks that are tuning in. It's hot in my office if you see I'm sweating. But your first year, and again, hopefully we have folks who are in their first year. Hopefully there's some folks who are in like junior high getting ready to go to high school. But if you're in your first year, your second year, you're a junior, you're a senior, this is my advice for anybody walking into high school day one, right? So know your high school profile. Most schools will have a high school profile. And what that is for people like me, for college admission professionals, it lets us see, what is offered at this school. How many years of foreign language? How many years of math? Are there honors or AP or IB? And the reason we need to know that is because we need to know what you're dealing with as a student. What were the resources, again, available to you, right? And so as a student, as a parent, as a counselor, you need to know your school profile, because that's how you can plan ahead for the next 4 years and say, okay, well, these are the schools I'm looking to attend. Here's where they would like me to be. Here's how I plan ahead. Push yourself academically. It's your first year. If you guys are looking at public institutions, most of them won't count the GPA of your first year, but I'll tell you what, you won't be an A student all of a sudden. Your study habits won't change sophomore year if you don't start that in your first year, okay, or even earlier. Pursue your passions personally, right? Have fun. It's your first year in high school, have some fun. Sophomore year, visit as many schools as you can. Again, there are a lot of different schools out there. If you are in California, we're lucky in that we have so many different options and so many different examples of all the different types of schools, small, medium, large. If you're anywhere in the country, you should have an example of one of those different types of schools within at least a couple of hours drive, or within maybe a couple of minutes, that kind of thing. So visit as many schools as you can, walk around. Does this feel right? Can I see myself here? That kind of thing. Start test prep. And I'll say that even knowing that, a lot of schools now, because of COVID, have gone test optional, right? I don't know how long that's going to stick around for. It's one of those things, SAT, ACT, they might be too big to fail. Once we kind of lick COVID and we get back to some sort of normalcy, you might see schools that revert back to that. So, if we do, then you might definitely want to start preparing yourself and getting ready for that. So sophomore year, start test prep. There's free stuff out there. Do your research. Google is your friend. Start the search for private scholarships. You wouldn't believe how it happens every single year. Folks apply to schools, get in, and then come talk to us asking about other private scholarships or the things we can bring in. You should have been doing that research a long time ago. And sophomore year is a good time to do that. There's some sites to check out right there. Big Future, Chegg, FastWeb. Do the research. Google is your friend. Junior year, a very important year academically, as most of you know. Is your schedule rigorous, right? Junior year is typically at most high schools when things like APs or advanced placement courses or IB courses will kind of come into play. You're kind of doing honors ahead of that. You want to step it up junior year. It's an important year. Keep those grades up. Take both tests if you can. Again, if you can, ACT and SAT. Start applying for private scholarships. Again, most private scholarships, the application process is an essay. So in order to just kind of apply to more, you just have to tweak it a little bit. Senior year, again, if tests are in the picture, retest if you need to, want to, or can. If you're looking at schools now that are test optional, don't worry about it. Do not worry about it. That is an added stressor that you simply don't need. We get it. We get it. This is, everybody's at home right now. I'm not in front of you presenting this because there's a pandemic going on, right? And so, if you don't have access to tests about it, don't worry about it. Many schools are not looking at those, Santa Clara included. Know and follow all application deadlines. That's very important. That is very important. A deadline is the last day that you can do something. There's no penalty for doing it early, okay? And so get things in on time. And that goes for financial aid deadlines as well. Never wait till the last minute, okay? I know there's some procrastinators out there. I was one myself. Almost done, folks, I promise. Just some things I think it's important for you all to know. The national average admit rate, in 2016 was 65%. It was 66% in 2015. I think had folks known that, we might not have had that Varsity Blues scandal, right? And the point being, we would have. Those folks are cheaters. We would have. But the reality is, getting into college is a lot easier. It is a much easier process than folks realize. Okay, this isn't something that you should stress out about. I'm gonna pause real quick because my kids are outside making noise. All right, whoopings for everybody when I get off of this. Just kidding, just kidding. I talk to my kids, I love them. And so again, the average admit rate, it's in that 65% range. And so just, again, do your research. Most public institutions will tell you, or systems will tell you the requirements for entry into their schools or their campuses. Most private schools deal with averages. Only 20% of schools have admit rates under 50%, right? So when you say selective, that's like 20% of all the schools in the land. All those schools are like single digit admit rates or admit rates in the teens. That's like 1% of all the schools in the land. Again, national average graduation rates. The national 4-year graduation rate is about 40%. For 6-year, the 6-year grad rate's 58%, 66% of publics, 76% of privates, 37% of private for-profits, right? So something to think about. Loans are a reality of college. Just be realistic. Again, going into 6-figure debt for a bachelor's degree, that ain't realistic, right? Especially when the starting salary for college graduates is around $50,000, right? 2019 average amount of loan debt per borrower is about $33,600. That's not too bad, folks. I mean, it's a lot of money, and it's a lot of money for a lot of folks. But if you can pay that off over 30 years and you're paying 100, 200, $150 a month over 30 years, it's doable, right? And so again, have an idea of the profession you want to go into. if you want to do, graduate school, that kind of thing, and, keep these things in mind. All right, almost done. Things to do, again, visit schools, discern what type of environment you see yourself in, compile a list of your top 5 schools and find the cost of attendance. Don't just hope and wish that money is going to take care of itself. Talk about those things and have those discussions with your family. Find your high school profile and compare it to the graduation requirements and the admission requirements of your state's public school systems, all that kind of stuff I talked about before. Follow the counseling guidelines year by year previously mentioned and all that. So again, know the numbers, right? Demographics, socioeconomics. Again, that's why a lot of society looks the way it does. That's why we're running into the issues that we're running into. That's why folks have to be reminded that Black lives matter, right? Know the demographics and the socioeconomics, because that all plays into what's going on today. Acknowledge and understand. That's it. Acknowledge and understand the systemic inequality in resources, generally speaking, for different socioeconomic groups and the resultant variance in life experiences and opportunities. Education is elevation. Education plus time equals $signs. Remember the high school formula of success. Go to school, pay attention, do well, do the work, know your options for college and find your fit, and apply by the deadlines. I can be reached at ahowellwilliams@scu.edu or tblauthor at Yahoo. The book can be found at that link or anywhere books are sold online. It's 150 pages, but it's a real good conversation if I do say so myself, and I'm funny in it and all that. So that's it. And hopefully there's some questions that I can get to them. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Is that all right? Cool, all right.
All right, well, thank you so much for that, AJ. That was really great. I really appreciate that, and I'm sure the students do as well. We do have some questions that have come up in the chat and in the Q&A box. Someone did ask about your book and where they could find it, so I'm glad that you shared that information with them. Let's see, another question. When you are referring to public-private schools, are you also referring to charter schools?
Yes, charter schools are technically public schools. When I said, so no, if the question is, when I was talking about public privates, what I meant by that was the kinds of schools that are in very nice areas, very affluent areas, that, again, because of the zip code that they're in and the property taxes that would come to a school in that zip code, they have as many resources as a private high school. That's what I mean by public-private. Again, I think any of us can think of wherever you're from, what's the good part of town, what's the rough part of town, and why is it considered the good part of town or the rough part of town? And then just think of the different resources that are available to a school in that area. That's what I mean by that.
Got it. Thank you. And then whoever asked that question, if you would like to do a follow-up, you can go ahead and write it in the chat as well. And we'll go ahead and ask it. Another question, someone has questions about transferring.
Sure.
They heard that transferring from a community college can be very good, but would like to know how you necessarily figure out if the school you want to transfer to will accept those transfer credits in your classes.
Yeah, great question. And again, I'm in charge of the transfer process for my institution. The reality is, honestly, that a lot of this information is online, and I'm not saying that to kind of push that question away. What I'm literally telling you is that if you go to CSUmentor.org, or you go to assist.org, they will, community colleges or the UC system or the CSUs or any sort of state systems will literally tell you what transfers from this community college to this campus, right? And so it really just takes a little bit of legwork on the student's side. Again, Google is your friend. For most private institutions, we either have transfer agreements with community colleges, Santa Monica College down in LA, wherever. And on our website, from our registrar side, it'll tell you the kind of courses that transfer over. Again, for private schools, it's not necessarily that you need X amount of units in X GPA. Really, what private schools kind of say is, we just want you to, we're going to recommend that you take these kind of courses, that you do well. Then it comes down to, do we have space in the program that you're going for? For a lot of the public systems, and especially in California, you need 60 semesters, which is basically your first 2 years, because the maximum amount of units that you can transfer into most schools is half of what it's going to take to graduate, right? Because in order for them to give you that diploma, they want to say that they educated you and got half your money, for at least half of your educational experience, right? That makes sense. So again, online resources are your friend when it comes to figuring out what transfers and what doesn't.
Thank you, Adrian. I do want to echo that. If you're a high school student and you are working with a fulfillment fund counselor, definitely set up an individual meeting, right? Go talk to them and ask about these questions, and they can definitely connect you to different campuses and people on the campuses that you're interested in too, to have those one-on-one conversations as well. If you are, high school senior, again, this is the time to ask, right?
And again, I just want to drill home the fact that, again, it's like 37% of all college students will transfer at some point. So transferring, and in some communities, it can be looked down upon. The reality is it's more used and utilized and useful than a lot of folks realize. So.
Definitely. Okay, we have another question. Oh, this is a good one. The student is asking if you could if you get accepted to a majority white school, and you are a person of color, you will more than likely have maybe a culture shock. But do you have any tips on how you can deal with that?
That's a great question, because the reality is, if you get admitted to a private school, you're going to, outside of a HBC, you're going to be going to a predominantly white campus. That's just again, universities are microcosms of the country, they're microcosms of the region that they're in, the city that they're in, all that kind of stuff. And so the reality is most schools are majority white, right? Especially for a private school. My advice at any institution that you go to, right off the bat, know your resources, right? You may not have participated in MECHA or your BSU in high school, that kind of thing. But you better know where that is and where those resources are on the campus that you attend, because at some point you're going to need it, right? Might not look like it, but I used to have beautiful, long flowing hair, right? You're going to get that question, hey, can I touch your hair? That's going to make you feel some kind of way, right? So you need to know where your resources are and who you can go to and talk to really just sort of have that network of people and that support group on any campus that you go to. And so that's my advice to everybody, because anyway, I don't care if you're from LA and you go to UCLA, it's going to be a shock. It's going to be a culture shock. And so you're going to have to adjust, but know where your resources are, both from the student level and from the administrative level. Find your affinity groups, that kind of thing, and just have it in your back pocket if you ever need it. That's my advice. But also be open to meeting people. I mean, that's a part of going to college, right? You're going to meet people and do things that you've never done before. You learn more, in my opinion, outside of the classroom than you do in the classroom in college. College is it's an experience. So yeah.
Yeah, great advice. Find your community, right? Whatever that means to you, whoever's going to be your support system on campus, make sure to find that, because regardless of whether you feel out of place or comfortable, there's a transition period, right? So find those people who will help you with that. Okay, next question. Okay, so someone's asking about, there are studies that show that some people with college degrees don't work in a job that necessarily match up with that. So how can students prevent this from happening and wasting their time, especially when we're looking at cost of attendance and, things like that?
That's a great question. And to the part of the question that said, how can you prevent that? I don't know if you need to. I don't know if that should be a goal. And what I mean by that is that I live in San Jose, California. I live in the Silicon Valley, right? Which is the tech mecca for the world. And a lot of those folks with letters behind their name, CEO, CFO, COO, whatever, OO, a lot of them had undergraduate degrees that are in the liberal arts, meaning, they were in the natural social sciences, whatever have you. The graduate degree speaks a little more to their business acumen, their ability to do what they do day in and day out in their job. So again, to that point I was making, college is, it's an experience. It's you're not a kid yet. You're not a kid anymore. You're not an adult yet. It's a maturation process. And so I've met with leaders of Fortune 500 companies and all that. You say, look, I don't care where you went or what you studied. I just care that you went. I care that you went, and because it shows that you have the fortuitousness, the ganas, the ability to stick through something and complete the task. Now, what I'll say is, and what I tell students all the time, because I think I run into students who, if you were to survey the national high school senior class right now, probably about 70% of the folks would raise their hand saying they want to do something business related. Because I think in everybody's head or in their mind, in order to be successful, you have to be a business major. That is not the case. That is not the case at all. I always say, unless you're going to be an accountant or an engineer, you don't necessarily need those degrees. Meaning, you can major in a lot of different things, or have the ability to double major, major and minor, that kind of stuff. So I would say have an idea of what you want to study. But a part of the beauty of college is taking a random class that sparks some interest that you didn't even know you had, right? And leads you down a path that you didn't even know you wanted to go down, right? I played basketball in high school through, that's what, paid through college for college and all that. Nobody could have told me that I would, be working in college admission, because you don't go to school to work in college admission. But I went to a small school, graduated. The people there knew me. They thought I'd be good for the position. I fell into it like most people do, and I love it, right? I've been doing it for a long time. So if you can, match your vocation with something that you like to do, with something you get paid for, by all means, have at it, It's a long-winded way to answer that question.
And I think any experience is good experience, right? We've kind of talked about this, where even if you have an internship, take a class, and you feel like, wow, I really don't like that, that's also really important to know, right? Because maybe you think you want to go into business and you take a class and you're like, nope, that's not what I thought it was. So it's really important to know what you don't like as well. Okay, so keeping that in mind. Okay, so about like the graduation rate. So if we're looking at graduation rates and it's a 6-year rate for 4-year schools, would you say that it's a 3-year graduation rate for quote unquote 2-year schools? And how much would you attribute that to, students having to work part-time, the affordability, and then, the availability of classes and counseling?
Those are all parts of it. Those are all parts of it. Whenever you hear that term impaction, right? What impaction usually means is that it's a reality usually at public institutions because of the volume exceeds the availability, right? And so the volume, it's that supply demand kind of issue. There's more students that need to take this accounting class in order to graduate on time than there are accounting class offerings. And so you have to stick around for another quarter, another semester, another year, that kind of thing. It's folks changing their mind late in the game and saying, okay, well, this really isn't my thing. I want to major in something else. Well, now you're a little bit behind in the 8 ball. It's resources. It's all those things that you mentioned. It's a lot of things that we haven't mentioned. There's a lot of reasons that go into it. Funding for public institutions is shrinking from the state level, that kind of thing. And so that's why you see rising costs and all that. There's a lot that goes into it. I was thinking of something, next question, but I was thinking of something that kind of played into that as well.
Yeah, and there was a second part, kind of a follow-up, and thinking about California community colleges and the guided pathways program, do you see any change in those statistics for community college students, and or do you think it hasn't been around long enough to get kind of those long-term changes that we're hoping to see?
Yeah, so there's that saying, if you don't know your history, you're bound to repeat it, right? And I think a good thing with knowing history is just realizing how little things change over time, right? And so the reality that we're seeing right now is more than likely going to be the reality for the next 10, 15, 20 years kind of thing in a lot of different ways. Hopefully things change, socially and things like that. But a lot of the sort of statistics that you see, they're not going to change overnight is my point. So I think that the guided pathways route, or the ADT, right, associate degree for transfer, those are all good ways to go. What I will tell you though, is that a very, very high percentage of community college students that transfer to 4-year schools do so without having achieved their associate's degree, okay? Now, that said, in the statistics that I showed you, education plus time equals $, those folks who had a high school diploma made about X amount. Those folks with an associate's degree made more than that, right? So you'll see that there is socioeconomic value and benefit to achieving a associate's degree on top of a high school degree and on your way to a bachelor's degree. But the reality is that is not necessarily a barrier to transferring to a 4-year, if that's clear. However, if you're in the UC system or the California public school system, you have to do your first 2 years at a community college before you're transferring. So you might as well get that associate's. Hopefully that's not too convoluted. But yeah. So in the big picture, you should get that degree. But also in the big picture, not getting that degree won't hamper your chances of transferring.
Yeah, I think for all of our students, whether you're going straight to a 4 year or you're planning to go to a community college, making sure that you're connecting once you get on campus with resources to make sure that you have all the information that you need for completing your degree, whether that's transfer or whatever your plan is. Because like you said, there's lots of changes all the time. Sometimes you're not aware of it. So make sure that you're asking questions and connecting with people on campus.
So I remember the second part to that question I was answering earlier, just in terms of like impaction and things like that, and the reality of, graduation rates and things like that. If there's any way, that we as a society, as individuals, can rationalize the big price tag difference between public and private education, I do it in the sense of your access to resources, right? So what you'll typically find at private schools, again, because they're private, they cost more, is that you have more access to your advisors, to professors. You don't run into impaction, that kind of thing. So you'll typically see higher retention rates, meaning folks going to and staying at the school, and higher graduation rates at medium-sized or smaller institutions. But again, that's why that price difference, that's a part of why that price difference is so substantial, right? And so that was that.
Thank you for that. And that kind of talking about scholarships and kind of costs. I have some students asking about, what is your take on maybe schools that are offering diversity scholarships or scholarships that are particularly for students of color, and students knowing that they will, or more than likely will experience some sort of culture shock. Do you recommend that they still go for those opportunities, right? Or what do you think about that?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, why not? And
All opportunities.
all opportunities. And I'm gonna be real. I really, and this is a point I kind of hit home in the book. I really wish that more underrepresented students did the research and looked at those smaller private schools that you've never heard of, right? Because I played basketball. I knew the Pac-12 because I see them on TV all the time. I knew the ACC, see them on TV all the time. There's a ton of schools out there that you've never heard of that are really good schools. And all the CEOs and doctors and lawyers of the world, they've heard of these types of schools, but you haven't. And those schools are looking for folks like you. They're looking for, now you can't just be, as my dad said, you can't just be brown. You got to be brown and about something. You got to be doing your work, right? Go to school, pay attention, do the work. And if you are, there's a ton of schools out there that are, just, they have scholarships, they have funding. Everybody should know the FAFSA, free application for federal student aid. The CSS profile is an additional form that most private schools will ask for. Fill those forms out, just see where the chips fall, and if the school that you get into is realistic. But yeah, I mean, I think just in terms of support, academically, socially, and all of that, I think there's a lot of really great small and medium-sized schools out there that students of color have no clue even exist, right? And so, again, go to college fairs, talk to people like me behind desks, and just say, hey, what's your school offer, that kind of thing. But yeah, any opportunity, go for it.
Thank you, AJ. Yeah, that's great, right? Like, there's not going to be more diversity in any of these institutions if we don't take the chance to go, right? So be the change, right? Be the change that you want to see. We always talk about that.
Yeah.
So very
a little Michael Jackson in here, huh?
Nice. Let's see. Okay, we have a couple minutes left. So if anybody has more last-minute questions, feel free to use the chat. We do have some specific questions from students about the SAT and the ACT. So if students have already taken the SAT or the ACT last year and they're currently a senior, would you still suggest that they take any upcoming tests, since maybe some other schools will want them to take the tests, or should they just stick with the tests that they have?
So right now, we are really trying to sort of break folks of being kind of stuck to where I have to test. We're in the middle of a pandemic, folks. And so I mean, one, your ability to test, I don't know how you're going to do it or where you're going to do it, but many of these schools in the country have gone test optional so that we can alleviate the stress for you. I mean, it really, I don't know, I can't speak for every institution, but at Santa Clara, whether you apply with or without test, we're going to look at you in terms of what you had control over, your GPA, the school you're coming from, what kind of courses you took, how rigorous your schedule is, the personal side, that kind of thing. If tests are submitted, they'll be seen as additional information, but they will have no bearing on your admission or any type of scholarships that you are able to qualify for, right? And so I think a lot of schools have gone that route because we know we don't want folks stressing out about it. And the reality is, it's at every end of the socioeconomic spectrum, right? We get calls from families that are saying, that have a lot of means, saying, I want to fly my kid to Wyoming so they can take this test. No, why would you? No, it's you don't have to do that. So again, don't stress out about it. If you have a score that you're very proud of, submit it. If you don't, or you weren't able to take a test, then don't. I think, again, read the policy of the schools you're applying to, but you should not, for the next 2 years at least, be penalized for that.
Great. Thank you for that. Yeah, and I think it's a lot of anxiety for students not really knowing what the plan is or what universities are going to decide. But I can say, working with a lot of students, universities, the same thing, right? They know that this is a tough time. They know that there's a lot of exceptions to be made. And all you have to do is ask as well, right? So if you really want a concrete answer from a specific university, reach out.
Yep.
That'll be your best bet.